welcome everybody, and thank you all for joining our session. And I'd like to say special thanks to our distinguished speakers from Hinrich Foundation, for spending time with us. So I'm sure it will be a very insightful discussion today. So before we start, let me quickly run through this session. So basically this 1 hour session will be divided into 2 parts. So the main discussion will be basically among the speakers and moderator. There will be 45 to 50 minutes. And in the last Q&A session, there will be 5 to 10 minutes for us to raise any question. But during the discussion, you are more than welcome to, of course, ask any questions in the chat box. So the moderator will choose some of the questions to incorporate into the main discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to pass on to our moderator, which is Andrew Staples. Here you go, Andrew.
Ken, thank you very much. Hopefully everybody can hear and see me okay. Delighted to be here today. My name is Andy Staples. I'm the Director of Research and Outreach at the Hinrich Foundation based here in Singapore. I'm joined today by 2 of my colleagues. Alex Capri, who is a research fellow for the foundation and also a lecturer at the business school at the National University of Singapore, in addition to many other things there as well. I'll ask both of our speakers to introduce themselves a little bit more in a moment. And our second speaker is Steve Olson, also a research fellow at the Hinrich Foundation with a long experience in trade negotiation, broke his teeth on the NAFTA agreement many years ago as a part of the US negotiating team. And Steve is based in Bangkok. The Hinrich Foundation is a private foundation. We're there to promote or advance sustainable global trade, and we define sustainable trade as trade that brings mutual benefits and therefore is continual and able to deliver benefits such as development in developing countries. We work to advance that through our research programs, so we generate a lot of research, and both Steve and Alex contribute to that program, and also on the education program as well. And I know that some people there are well familiar with the foundation. So with that, I'm going to get us underway, and we've got a huge number of questions that have been generated by you, the audience, so we're very happy to go through, but all relating to this relationship between the United States and China. So the session is titled as a deep dive into US-China relations. And I guess this is a multifaceted relationship that's quite dynamic. It's changed quite significantly over the years, but in the past couple of years, we've certainly seen a deterioration in that relationship between these 2 core global economies, the US and China. Now, why is that? Well, as I say, there are many reasons for it, geopolitical reasons, there are social reasons, political reasons, and so on. But we could also be focusing right in on issues related to trade and technology. I said that the relationship has deteriorated over the past couple of years, and really that's exemplified in the trade war that we find ourselves in at the moment. Indeed, some people go on to say that we're actually in a new Cold War if we think about all the other issues that need to be addressed between the 2 powers as well. But for today, I think we want to focus on trade and related issues, and particularly around technology. So with that sort of opening, I want to pass over to Steve Olson, as I mentioned, is one of our research fellows and an expert in trade negotiations. And Steve, if I could pose to you a sort of opening question, get your thoughts and comments on where has this trade war come from? Why do we have such bad relations between the US and China when it comes to trade?
Well, thanks, Andy, very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us today. I look forward to hopefully having an opportunity to have a discussion like this with all of you in person someday post-pandemic. In terms of the origins of what we refer to as the US-China trade war, from my point of view, Andy, the root cause is actually fairly straightforward. We haven't quite yet figured out how to reconcile 2 fundamentally different economic systems under the rubric, under the framework of a single set of global trade rules. Now, keep in mind, our existing global trade architecture was created in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, and it was predicated almost entirely on US philosophical principles. These are the so-called Washington consensus principles: free markets, free trade, and the government largely keeps its nose out of business and the marketplace. Now, in the early decades of this system, no one could have ever possibly have anticipated China's economic rise. Then in the later decades, when China's economic rise was becoming more evident, the assumption was that China will inevitably, quote unquote, become just like the United States. Well, of course, we're at the point now where it's recognized that's never going to happen. China is not going to become just like the United States. It will continue to pursue its own unique development model. And almost all of the points of friction that we see today between the United States and China are a result of these two fundamentally different economic systems that are now with increasing frequency sort of bumping up against each other as the size and the technological sophistication of China's economy continues to grow. And what's become sadly evident and has resulted in the trade war is that the existing rules of global trade are entirely inadequate to adjudicate and to resolve these disputes. The final point I'll make, Andy, is that Donald Trump is frequently, quote unquote, blamed for starting the trade war. But from my point of view, Donald Trump is a symptom, not the cause. He is an outgrowth of these underlying issues which had been building up a little bit like lava underneath the surface, and were going to assert themselves and have to be dealt with one way or another. So I do think it's a little bit of a misnomer to ascribe responsibility for starting the trade war to President Trump. We've got much more core fundamental issues at the heart of this dispute.
Thank you for mapping that out. And Steve, if I could just push you as well, where are we in this trade war, which has been going on for some time now? We've got a phase 1 deal, but where are we with that? What about phase 2, and so on?
Andy, we're in a little bit of a strange period, whether we want to refer to it as sort of a hiatus, an interregnum, a little bit of a pause. But what's happened is that there are so many external issues demanding attention. The impending US presidential election, of course, the coronavirus pandemic, and the rising geostrategic tensions over things like Huawei, Hong Kong, South China Sea, etc., that the trade agenda has been somewhat pushed off onto a side burner. It's almost as if the countries have decided to keep the trade issues on a low simmer during this precarious time in the broader relationship, because they don't want to risk a blow up in trade, which will spill over into the broader relationship at this precarious moment. In terms specifically of the phase 1 trade agreement, some elements of it are being fully and faithfully implemented. China has removed restrictions on 3 different types of beef hormones. It's made some legislative and judicial changes to improve trademark and patent protection. But the centerpiece of the agreement are these purchase requirements. China has already fallen so far behind in these purchases, which were going to be ambitious under the best circumstances, that it's now almost a foregone conclusion that it will not be able to live up to its obligations. And yet both countries seem content to sort of put a positive spin on things. Again, not wanting to risk a blow up in trade while the relationship is on a little bit of rocky ground. And the final point I'll make is something that gets lost in the shuffle, but is extremely important, was keep in mind the phase 1 agreement was relatively the simpler issues. Phase 2 negotiations was supposed to be where the rubber met the road, where the real tough negotiating on the quote unquote real issues was going to take place. It was expected that these negotiations certainly would have been commenced by now and maybe even been concluded. They've been very quietly dropped. And there's no talk about when or if they'll be revived. So we're in a little bit of a period where both countries seem to want to keep the trade issues on a bit of a low simmer.
Thanks, Steve, very much. And I'm going to now pull in Alex, because we've been talking about trade, and one of the triggers has been sort of identified as the size of the US deficit with China over the years, which has been huge. And so the trade one deal focused on things like getting China to buy more agricultural products and energy and so on. But really, a lot of people think that a much deeper, more structural issue is around technology and around supremacy, or who has leadership in sort of next generation technologies as well. So nobody better than to bring in Alex Capri. Alex, you've had a long experience in value chains, logistics, everything to do with global trade management, but this year you've been publishing with us a series of papers looking at techno-nationalism, which is very much zeroed in on these issues. So with that, let me pass over to you, and if we could turn our attention a little bit to these issues around technology.
Well, yes, Andy. Technology, of course, is at the core of the rivalry, and there are reasons for that, right? Technology is now linked to this phenomenon that we're calling techno-nationalism, which means that a nation state, China certainly, US of course, will link its economic prowess, it will link its national security issues, and it will now increasingly link social stability to its capacity to innovate and its ability to produce technology. Why? Because that technology facilitates all of these things. It facilitates economic growth. Obviously, it's needed for national security and defense purposes. But now I think increasingly, and this is where I think we're really going to start seeing an acceleration of fragmentation of value chains. Increasingly, we're going to see ideology tethered to how technology is used. So for example, if Intel sells a microchip that ends up in a Hikvision facial recognition camera that ends up being shipped to Xinjiang province in Western China, and that camera is used to monitor or surveil, in this case, the Muslim population there, that is, those actions are perceived as human rights violations in Europe, in the US, in parts of the West, etc. So we now have sanctions that have been placed against companies that are in fact seen to be using technology to prosecute those types of human rights violations. And that's not just monitoring, but it's censorship of information, it's data privacy, or the failure to protect data privacy and so forth. So these issues in this technology Cold War, which I absolutely think it is, are going to continue to produce balkanization within value chains and within ecosystems, and even fragmentation along standards. So ideological standards linked to technology.
And just to push you on that point, what does that mean? If we've got a lot of business school students here, got to go and develop careers in industry. So the question is, so what? If we see this this fragmentation, this bifurcation, what are the real world implications of that?
Well, we're seeing decoupling happening in a very strategic way, right? So globalization, as we've come to know it over the past 2 decades, and of course, like Steve, I started my career a long time ago with the US government, with US Customs, and I actually watched this phenomenon of globalization spreading, and this phenomenon of offshoring, where more and more production capacity was offshored to places like China. As we see this phenomenon of techno-nationalism taking hold, what we're seeing is an acceleration of strategic decoupling. In order for that to happen, we have to have the reshoring, meaning the relocation of manufacturing operations from China, for example, back to more domestic, ring-fenced environments like the United States, like Europe. So that, for if you're thinking of a career and you're going to work for a multinational company, it's going to be much different working for a multinational company today and in the next 3, 4, 5, 10 years as it was 10 years ago. because you could go all over the world. Your value chains were truly global. You had unrestricted flow of tangible goods. You had unrestricted flow of data. Now, of course, data is being localized. And you had unrestricted flow of human capital. So all of these things are changing now. And that's a fundamental change, for prospective business students.
And I guess if we aggregate all of that activity, reshoring, data privacy laws, meaning that you can't roll out services as you might have done in previous years. At the global level, that means that the global economy slows somewhat, that that growth engine is more constrained by political realities as well. And that has a big implication for us here in Asia, where we've seen all of those massive benefits of trade and foreign direct investment, the hundreds of billions of people lifted out of poverty over the decades of globalization. But there will be winners in this as well. We talked a little bit about reshoring, but we've also seen quite a trend of people looking to take parts of their supply chains, part of their value chains out to China and relocate them elsewhere, where there's still advantages to locate parts of your value chain outside of your home country. I'm thinking specifically of Vietnam, for example, which has been a big beneficiary of this, and not just in terms of textiles and so on, but increasingly in terms of tech as well. I wonder if you've got some comment on that sort of process.
Yeah, so again, think of supply chains as organic living things, right? Think of it as a tree, you've got the roots and the branches growing everywhere, and then you have some kind of a natural event that, the wind blows part of the tree over, or somebody comes and chops off a branch, which is what these exogenous events are, right? The trade tariffs and non-tariff measures and so forth. What happens is those roots grow back in different formations, right? Those branches come back differently. And that's what we're seeing in terms of the restructuring of supply chains. So on the one hand, there are opportunities for companies to localize production and move that production as close as possible to their markets. And part of that is happening anyway because of automation. And so it makes sense to produce as close to your market as possible. That was going to happen anyways. The other is that as you have this restructuring of supply chains going on, there are all kinds of capacity building opportunities for entire industries. So, think about it, from the legal industry to the accounting industry to the construction industry and the logistics industry, this change is facilitating different kinds of economic growth. Of course, there will be losers to a certain extent, as you move production around, but there's also going to be a large amount of winners. So it's not necessarily the end of the world, and it's not the end of globalization. I think The Economist called it slowbalization, right? But we could see dynamic growth happening in these new localized areas, and I think. Steve will probably talk a little bit more about, what could happen after the election with a Biden in the office, in the White House. I would say that if Biden makes good on what he's promising, his so-called, a new deal, a new digital deal for the United States with new infrastructure and digital infrastructure and so forth, so-called repair and prepare for the next generation, there will be massive economic opportunities for global companies in the United States as well as in Europe, if Europe follows the same path around clean tech and so forth.
There's a very interesting sort of evolution of globalization, if you like, or devolution of it, because we seem to, regions are becoming more and more important as we move away from a sort of unipolar world to a multipolar world as well. Maybe that's something we can come back to a little bit later on. But you raised the US presidential election there, and that is a question that we've had submitted, and it's a really important one as November gets closer and closer. So, Steve, over to you. There's a lot of speculation about what the outcome is going to be, and I guess we know that there are there are 2.5 scenarios. There's a Trump 2.0 second term, there's a Biden presidency, and then there's a conflicted result. But let's not go there. Let's think about scenario 1 and 2.
Sure. Well, if you would be willing to indulge me, Andy, just a quick comment. I wanted to follow up on
Sure.
some of the good points Alex was making on this decoupling phenomenon. I think it's important to understand, to a certain extent, the decoupling that we're seeing now and that Alex has written about and spoken about so usefully, to a certain extent, is inevitable. I think, with the benefit of hindsight, we now can see that the very high level of economic integration that both these countries have been very enthusiastically pursuing for the better part of the past 2 decades, frankly speaking, was probably unrealistic and maybe even a little bit unwise, given the fact that the economic systems are so different, the underlying governing philosophies are so different, and given the rising sort of geostrategic rivalry between these two countries, we probably got out a little bit too far. And so this decoupling is probably a useful correction. Keep in mind also, nobody is suggesting an across-the-board decoupling. It would be partial, and there will continue to be areas where these two countries can cooperate, collaborate, engage in mutually beneficial trade. I think everybody would be delighted to see U.S. farmers selling more soybeans and corn. I don't think anybody's going to be perturbed if Chinese citizens want to use U.S. shampoo to wash their hair. I think that's all fine, but frankly speaking, should we ever have had any expectation that Huawei was going to be permitted to participate in building the 5G network in the United States? No, we probably shouldn't, and if we did, we were a little bit naive. So I think this process that Alex has spoken about so usefully and so much insightfully, I think we should recognize it's probably inevitable. And we might ultimately end up in a much better place. It doesn't need to be adversarial. It doesn't need to be confrontational, and it can result in both of these countries having a much more mature, realistic relationship built on reality rather than fantasy. So, quick take on the decoupling issue. On the potential impact of a potential Biden administration. Couple points I'll make quickly here, Andy. I think certainly under a Biden administration, the tone, the tenor, and the rhetoric on trade policy is going to look and feel a lot different. But when you come right down to it, the actual substance of trade policy under a Biden administration might be less different than a lot of people are either expecting or hoping for. Biden has been very clear that he is going to pursue a U.S. worker-centered trade policy that looks and sounds very much like Donald Trump's trade policy. He's outlined a number of areas where he wants to toughen up U.S. enforcement on a variety of issues, subsidization, technology transfers, et cetera, that look very, very similar to sort of the trade agenda of the Trump administration. And so much so that Trump has gone so far as to accuse Biden of plagiarism when it comes to his trade policy. So certainly, the rhetoric, the tone, the tenor, some of the, seeming craziness of the Trump administration, the constant tweeting, the back and forths, don't expect to see that under a Biden administration. That will change, but the basic substance of the policy might not change that much. I will point you towards, however, 2 areas where I do think you're going to see a little bit of a change. Biden clearly has a much greater respect for and affinity for the value of international institutions. Okay, so this quote unquote U.S. war on the WTO is probably going to stop, or at least abate somewhat. Biden will see significantly more value in the WTO than the Trump administration does. Now, as a side note, I'll point out he is going to have some challenges because some of the policies that he's articulated, some of his Buy American policies, for instance, are going to be hard to square with U.S. Commitments and obligations in the WTO. But from a principle point of view, he'll be much more amenable to that institution. He will not take a sledgehammer to the WTO in the same way the Trump administration has. The other point I'll make where you will see a sharp difference is deep in his core, deep in his DNA, Joseph Biden believes in the power of alliances, and in particular, the North Atlantic Alliance. And one of his first jobs upon becoming president, if he becomes president, will be to start the process of repairing the US-EU alliance. This could have very important implications for US-China, because although the laundry list of US complaints and European complaints about Chinese trade policies look very, very similar, they haven't been able to present as much of a unified front because Donald Trump has been lobbing hand grenades across the Atlantic into the EU. And I think you're going to see much more of a United States-EU united front. You know, the conventional wisdom is that China prefers a Biden presidency. I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure. Yeah. Because I think, you know, the Chinese policymakers rightly perceive that he will reinvigorate that North Atlantic Alliance and provide much more unified pressure on China. So I'm not so sure that there's a preference in Beijing for a Biden presidency. The other issue they've got with Trump is he has no philosophical leanings. The Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, fundamentally distrusts the Chinese Communist Party. Robert Lighthizer fundamentally distrusts the Chinese Communist Party. Trump has no similar philosophical qualms. He is a deal maker. And they know that regardless of how heated the rhetoric gets, there's going to always be a possibility to make a deal with Trump when he calculates it's in his political interests. So, as I said, conventional wisdom is that Chinese policymakers prefer Biden. I'm not so sure.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. And Alex, I know you got some comment on that. I'd like to bring you in a second, but just on that point of alliances, because we've got a few questions coming in about, you know, what's the role of Europe, of ASEAN within all of this as well. And it does seem that there's the mood music in Europe, for example, has changed with regards to China. Even just today, the Germans sort of changing their tune on their relationship. Britain did an about-face when it came to Huawei and building the 5G system. We've got a new prime minister in Japan by the end of next week. China and India have very bad relationships at the moment as well. So there does seem that potential there to build alliances. Alex, let me bring you in on that point as well, and maybe again sort of focus a little bit more on technology in that context.
Yeah, so I well put by Steve, and let me just expand a little bit on what Steve was saying about Biden sort of shoring up those alliances, particularly in the transatlantic alliance. There's a very fundamental techno-nationalist element that is going to be addressed there when it comes to the European Union and China. And I totally agree that the European Union is in the process of a major recalibration of its relationship with China. And it's come about because of, again, how technology is being used, or how technology is being perceived as being used by the Chinese state, and how those values are fundamentally different from European liberal democratic values. And so one area where I see a new level of commitment is at NATO, and NATO shifting its focus to cybersecurity and cyber warfare. So if you look at this burst of activity that we've seen in what I'll call techno-diplomacy, and that is certainly going to increase under Biden, we will see the Europeans and the Americans in particular forming AI alliances, forming alliances around standards, again, around those ideological standards that I mentioned earlier with technology. That, in essence, puts Chinese companies looking to expand out of China, meaning the big digital companies, whether it's Alibaba or Tencent or Huawei, it puts those companies in an existential crisis, because they are viewed essentially as proxies of the Chinese state, because of the state-centric economic system that they've grown up in, and again, because they are obligated to turn over data when requested under the cybersecurity law of China, under the national security law of China, and so forth. So from a transatlantic relationship perspective, we will see the coming together of the Europeans and the Americans in particular. I think for Southeast Asia, Andy, we're going to see a really interesting mix of countries looking to implement sort of techno-nationalist standards where they're going to look to avoid a binary choice of having to choose China, US. They're going to try and do business with both, sort of tiptoe around the issues. We saw that Singapore, which has announced a major rollout of a 5G network system, Singapore has opted to go with a multiple contractor route, and they're going with Ericsson and Nokia, but they are bringing in a whole ecosystem of local firms to participate in the building of, bespoke architecture that addresses security issues and so forth and so on. So I think avoiding this binary choice is going to be very important if it's possible with Southeast Asian countries.
So just one more point on the US presidential election before we move on. We've been talking about the Biden presidency. I was looking at a betting site the other day. Of course, can't bet in Singapore. It's just looking for the odds. They're neck and neck. I mean, let's not discount that we could have a second term for Trump. And going back to your earlier point, Steve, about who Beijing would like to see in the White House. Conversely, could it be that, knowing that Donald Trump is a deal maker, that suddenly on November the 4th we wake up, Trump is there for another 4 years, that something changes in Beijing, they realise they've got to get a deal done? Let me pose that question to you.
I think it's entirely possible, Andy. Answering that question definitively would require me to sort of crawl inside the head of Donald Trump, and that's something I could not and would not want to do. But yeah, I think it's the scenario that you laid out is entirely plausible. Trump could once we get through the election, and positioning himself as tough on China and deflecting criticisms from Joseph Biden that he's been weak on China, once that's no longer an issue, if he finds himself in a second term, he would be much more amenable to doing a deal. I think Chinese certainly would recognize that. So if we find ourselves in in January and February of 2021 with a second Trump administration, I think it is entirely plausible that the negotiators get back to the table and we do see some movement on those phase 2 negotiations. Okay. Real quick point, if I may, to follow up on Alex's point about this whole issue of countries, particularly in ASEAN, potentially being put in a position of having to choose between the United States and China. I really think we've got to give a lot of credit to a lot of these middle power countries, because I think they have been and probably will continue to be incredibly astute about not allowing themselves to be put in that position. And I think Singapore has kind of taught a master class, not just recently, but over the decades, in how to walk that fine line between maintaining good relationships with the United States, benefiting from that relationship, maintaining good relations with China, and benefiting from that relationship without being forced to choose. So I think in some areas, yeah, we will see this increased pressure for countries to sign up with one side or another. But a lot of these middle powers are very savvy about how to strike that balance. And I noticed within the last 48 hours, the Indonesian foreign minister came, right out deliberately and said to the United States, don't drag us into your fight with China. We want to maintain good relations with both countries. So there will be some pressure to do that, particularly in technology sectors. But I think these middle power countries can be quite savvy about avoiding that.
So just a quick plug to everybody for another Hinrich Foundation paper that you can find on our website, hinrichfoundation.com, by Dr. Alan DuPont in Australia, which looks at ways to de-risk the Cold War. And we had a session with him and an academic panel yesterday at RCEP. One of his policy recommendations there is the role of middle powers in diplomacy and building trust and frameworks there in between those two bigger powers. So I recommend that to everybody. Let's move on. I'm sort of taking some of the questions that are coming through and reformulating them as questions to Alex and Steve as we go on. But I do encourage you all to be sending those through. There's a few questions there, Alex, coming to you now around currencies. And I know that recently you did some work looking at the sort of digital currencies and looking at the role of this. Sorry, Alex, I was directing this to. There's a specific question about China opening up its financial markets. What implications are of this for capital markets? What about the increased tension that we see around Hong Kong, access to the US dollar denominated global financial infrastructure and so on? So within that sort of broad area, I'd like to get your comments.
Yeah, so when people think of decoupling, money or currencies don't immediately come to mind. But in fact, this is an area where we could see some movement of financial decoupling for a couple of reasons. First, you have Beijing, of course, is working very, very hard to establish an electronic version of the renminbi, the e-renminbi. And the reason they want to do that is they want to start engaging in trade regionally, with their partners in the region, and then along the Belt and the Road as the Belt and the Road begins to pick up steam. They want to use the e-renminbi and not the US dollar. The US dollar continues to be the major currency in use. 60% of reserves are still US dollars. And much of Chinese trade engaged, in Chinese companies engaging in that trade are using dollars. What that means is they are vulnerable to US sanctions, because any transaction that occurs anywhere in the world with a US dollar gets traced back through the SWIFT system, back to the Federal Reserve banking system in the United States. And therefore the US government can either sanction a bank that is actually facilitating that transaction, or they can they can have the accounts frozen of any entity that is using that financial institution. So interestingly enough, when Facebook announced that it was going to be rolling out Libra, which is this digital currency, this cryptocurrency, Beijing and the Chinese Communist Party, they doubled down on their efforts to try and move forward with the e-currency. So that's one area. The other is we could see potentially, if the relationship deteriorates more, and let me just say, I've been in Asia now for 20 plus years, working in China, for more than a decade, working all across the region. Steve's been in Asia for, at least 2 decades. We've done a lot of work, across the region. I can tell you, I've never seen anything like this, Andy. I've never seen discussions about delisting Chinese companies in the US on stock exchanges and even in Europe because of lack of transparency and because of governance standards, corporate governance standards that don't align. So we could see that. You couple that with currency decoupling. And then even the currency decoupling and this move to digital currency brings out this clash of ideologies once again with China and the West. Because again, a digital currency means data and data collection and the ability to monitor everything that somebody does in terms of their use of that currency, right? And so now we have, once again, privacy issues, surveillance issues, and so forth. So all of this seems to be heading towards sort of this balkanization of not just potential trading blocks around ideology, again, with strategic goods, not all goods, like Steve said, okay? But also this sort of balkanization of financial blocks as well.
Yeah, indeed. Let's stay on that area and get a bit more topical then. TikTok. What information does TikTok actually collect And is that different from any other social media platform? Why has TikTok exploded into the consciousness? And where do we go from here? I think one for you, Alex.
Okay, so I mean, it's a good question. You know, a bunch of 14-year-olds, you know, sharing streaming videos. How can that possibly be a national security risk? Well, look, it's much bigger than that. It's the idea of access to data and metadata that gets generated from all the user information and the algorithms that are producing information about users. In and of itself, that's a rather innocuous thing. But if you look at what AI does today now with data from one individual and ties it to 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 different points of data, this is what Facebook does, this is what Google does, etc. Then you have all kinds of sort of overlapping data points that could be harvested and used because of their connectivity to so many other data points. So with sophisticated AI, you can find out information about, you know, people that are, you know, far removed from the user but are connected through other types of interaction. So again, that becomes a potential security issue. And because, of course, TikTok is tied to ByteDance, which, of course, has obligations under Chinese law, once again, to cooperate and participate with the Chinese state when called upon to do so, this becomes an issue.
And Alex, just before I move back to Steve, because there's a couple of interesting questions on going back to the sort of multilateralism, global trading system, free trade agreements, and so on. But one further one, and I know that you've written a lot in this area as well around semiconductors and the pressure that the US is putting on China. How is that going to play out? We know that China is somewhat dependent on US chips. We know that there's a lot of investment going in next generation manufacture of chips and so on. How is that whole issue going to play out in the coming months and years?
Well, I think we have to look at it, Andy, in terms of sort of short-term, medium, and long-term. I think in the short term, the U.S. weaponization of semiconductor supply chains, because U.S. companies dominate the technology at the front end, which is the design software and the design IP and technology, and at the manufacturing side, which is the equipment needed to manufacture, you know, large, high-volume, high-yield microchips, because of the chokehold that the U.S. has in particular on those segments of the value chain. Technically, you know, if we really truly saw a deterioration of the relationships, the U.S. could literally shut down the supply of microchips to not just Huawei, but to the other big companies, including Alibaba, which needs those chips for its infrastructure, essentially for its, you know, for its cloud infrastructure and so forth. Of course, the collateral damage to that would be massive. So that's short term. So in the midterm, if we look at sort of the bandwidth of semiconductors, you know, from the very, very leading edge at the front, which is a 5 nanometer chip, and it's almost impossible to make, and only a few companies in the world can do it. If we back that up and we go back to, say, 10 nanometers or 12 nanometers, if Chinese companies can figure out how to get the manufacturing equipment or make it themselves, which it will be very, very, very difficult to do, at least in the next 5 years, maybe even the next 10 years. But if they can get access to that manufacturing equipment and they can produce 10, 12 nanometer chips, those chips will be able to function in a large part of the smartphone market. They'll be able to function in a lot of the consumer electronics market, you know, that we see. So they don't necessarily have to achieve leading edge, you know, breakthroughs. But if they can just migrate to where they can produce in large quantities at the you know, the 12, the 10, even the 7 nanometer mark, then they should be able to service a fairly large chunk of the consumer market.
Okay, thank you. Time is moving on. I want to bring Steve back into the conversation. Going back to WTO. WTO is seems to be stuck in a rut. President Trump has very clearly indicated that he's fine with walking away from it. At the same time, we've seen the CPTPP inaugurated in this part of the world without the US. We've had the EU and Japan sign an FTA. UK and Japan are on the verge of signing an FTA as well. Where are we with the global sort of multilateral trading system? And is it the case that we're going to have to step down from that multilateral global model and focus more on regional and intra-regional and inter-regional FTAs?
I think at least in the short term, we have to readjust our expectations about what the WTO can be. I mean, look, the WTO is supposed to function as the global trade referee, and we're living through the most significant trade war in almost 100 years, and the WTO has been almost entirely irrelevant to that process. The other cornerstone function of the WTO is to lead the multilateral trade liberalization agenda. Well, look, that's completely dead in the water, and nobody's even seriously considering reviving that. So I think, you know, at least in the short term, the WTO is not going to be able to play that ambitious role that we initially hoped it would. I do think you will see, by default, countries turning towards regional trade agreements, and I think that propensity is going to be strengthened both by the US-China trade war as well as the pandemic. One of the things that the pandemic is going to do is put more emphasis on shorter supply chains and more regional trade. And I think really the big winner in this can be, in fact, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That gives a real nice opportunity for those countries. Keep in mind, at least as of now, neither the United States nor China are a member of the TPP. So that gives countries an opportunity regionally to shorten supply chains and to also diversify their trade away from both the United States and China. So at least in the short term, I think, you know, I would not be surprised at all over the course of 2021 to see an increase in interest in memberships in additional countries joining the TPP. So clearly, multilateral trade liberalization dead in the water, and I think, Andy, you're right. I think we could see countries increasingly turning to bilateral and regional trade agreements.
The CPTPP is a very interesting one, isn't it? Because in theory, it's open to anybody if you sign up to the rules of the club, right? Which China would not be willing to do at the moment. But other countries like South Korea, like Thailand, for example, have indicated a willing. Even the UK, I think the UK is probably waiting for global warming so they can sail over the top and join the Pacific. But, so that looks like an interesting model that we might see a greater focus on.
I think so. You know, one word of caution I give you, though, on the TPP, it has been presented as being this very high quality, high standard free trade agreement. And arguably, it probably is the highest quality agreement that we've got. But I don't think it lived up to its expectations. I don't think it lived up to the hype. And I think a lot of, you know, I honestly think that China probably could, if it wanted to, meet the terms of the TPP. They could use some, you know, every trade agreement has non-conforming measures where you get little carve-outs where you've got a little bit of wiggle room for things that are going to be difficult for you to meet. So I think, you know, as originally envisioned, I don't think China could have joined the TPP. But in terms of where that agreement actually ended up, which is slightly less ambitious than as originally advertised, I do think a country like China, if it decided it was in its interests, could in fact join, could in fact meet its obligations.
Okay, and let's just shift attention to another, you know, big free trade agreement, the RCEP, based here around ASEAN, but including other partners, including China and Japan. India is a country that's come up a few times in the questions there. The likelihood of it emerging as a manufacturing hub, as we see some of those supply chains coming out of China, for example, the likelihood of it signing up to RCEP. What role is India playing within this? or could it be?
The first comment I'd make on RCEP is my frank assessment is there's probably less there than meets the eye. I mean, this is a trade agreement that is considerably less ambitious than most of the other agreements we see either recently agreed to or under negotiation. And in fact, I would argue, you know, this agreement might even have difficulty qualifying under the WTO requirement that preferential trade agreements need, quote unquote, substantially all trade. And this was largely as a result of India really dragging its feet. I think India really had misgivings about entering into a free trade agreement that included China, because India is eager to compete with China in a lot of areas where China currently is well ahead. And I think India was probably correctly concerned that by agreeing to this free trade agreement that includes China, it would sort of solidify China's place ahead in some of these manufacturing sectors where India aspires to compete. So India has certainly been within the RCEP community a bit of a laggard in its initial tariff offer in terms of what it was willing to cut tariffs on. Frankly speaking, as a former trade negotiator, I found shocking. You know, I found shocking how much trade was not going to be covered and how unambitious their aspirations were. But India is not alone. A lot of the ASEAN countries don't have a significantly greater appetite to really move forward aggressively in the areas where there are remaining restrictions. So RCEP, I think actually that's an agreement where there might be slightly less there than meets the eye.
Okay, so maybe not so interesting with RCEP and Prime Minister Modi sort of Make in India campaign, you know, based around sort of manufacturing seems to be somewhat overly ambitious. But in terms of technology, Alex, India is a key player. How is its role? How is it sitting within this difficult relationship between the United States and China? We saw, because of the border incident a couple of weeks ago, we saw the sort of banning of Chinese apps and so on. But as it looks to build its own sort of 5G system, where does India sit within this?
Yeah, I mean, India is a really interesting outlier when it comes to techno-diplomacy, techno-nationalism, because they have essentially frozen out China. It looks like Huawei will not be doing anything or much of anything of any significance in India now. They've, as you mentioned, Andy, they've banned now around 200 Chinese apps. You know, India is certainly no shining example of internet freedom. There's no question about that. But India is the world's largest democracy. And if we go back to, again, putting standards on technology and technology companies that can operate in India, we have an existential crisis for Chinese companies, again. So India being a large shifting market, yes, there will be shifting of manufacturing from China to India. Apple is moving and is in the process of moving a fifth of its iPhone production from China to India. So India, I think, will also create very large market opportunities for Western companies now, digital companies, with Chinese companies essentially being pushed out. So that, you know, India is an emerging market for example, low-end cell phones, smartphones. You know, if we start seeing some non-Chinese companies, other than than the big brands that are making the sort of the low-cost phones in the emerging market, if we see Apple, Samsung deciding to really move in that space, I think that will have spillover effects into other parts of the emerging world, including sub-Saharan Africa and even Southeast Asia. So I think India is, you know, India's decision to essentially isolate itself from China, backing out of the RCEP, doing what it's doing, I think is a big deal, with big ramifications.
Okay, we're coming into the last few minutes, so I'm just going to ask Steve and Alex to give us a final comment on one key issue to keep in mind in this area of US-China relations, or maybe it's one thing that we haven't discussed, or what was something that did come up that's really important to keep focus on in the coming months and into next year. I just wanted to take a couple of quick questions whilst you're marshalling your thoughts there. There was one there from Daniel. Daniel Free, from where I'm sat, Australia looks like China is picking fights with everybody. Is this a fair assessment? Well, there's a very good article, again, on the Hinrich Foundation website, looking at wolf warrior diplomacy and this type of response that we've seen. You know, why now, and why so seemingly aggressive in India and South China Sea, with Japan, with the States, and so on? And is that backfiring? Is that is there a change of course that we're starting to see in Beijing? That's an interesting read, so I'd recommend that to you. But look, we've got 3 minutes left, so very quickly, going to come to Steve, going to come to Alex, and then we wrap up. Steve.
Sure. Real quick comment, Andy. I think the key thing for now, until at least the beginning of the year, when we either have a Biden administration or a re-elected Trump administration, the trade agenda is going to be kept on a very, very, very low simmer. So I think for now, we sit tight and we see what the world looks like in early 2021.
Okay, thank you. And Alex?
Just very quickly, 2 words: paradigm shift. We are in a paradigm shift. It's bigger than a trade war. It's the systemic fundamental differences that Steve talked about between these 2 superpowers. Those, regardless of who's in the White House, those dynamics will continue to play out. The general trajectory of US-China relations will continue in the direction that it is, which means more fragmentation, more localization, strategic decoupling, and sort of a bifurcation of trade relations, but an absolute recalibration in a neo-mercantilist world where we're going to see fundamental change.
I'd like to echo that. I think it's really important for people to understand this paradigm shift, that we're moving on from where we were with globalization, with the certainties that many economies have grown up with, that people, myself included, grown up with over the past few decades, into something different. So it's evolving. So keeping track of everything that's taking place, particularly with these key economies of US and China, and particularly with that focus on Asia, or more broadly Indo-Pacific, is going to be crucial. And one way that you can do that, of course, is by keeping updated with what's going up on our website. So we're constantly publishing articles, white papers on these themes. So everything that's related to do with trade, with issues to do with foreign direct investment, and of course that central mission that we've got of advancing sustainable global trade. Please do get on our mailing list and have a look at the content we got there. We are right at time, so I'd like to extend my thanks to all of you for joining, all the people who sent in questions. And if we didn't get to answer your question directly, hopefully we did cover a lot of the themes that were raised in your questions. And would also like to thank Steve and Alex for their time this afternoon, and to INSEAD for putting this together. So I'm going to hand back to Ken now. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Very informative discussion, and I for one have certainly enjoyed it. So for me, there's not much to say other than thank you all for participating. And I know everybody is very busy. If you do have a further question, please do reach out to me. So if there's any question, I'll just relay back to Hinrich Foundation to see if there's a way to answer you guys. All right, so basically that's all. Thank you.